Going to be in Mark chapter 3 this morning, picking up in verse 20. We are going to continue the story of what it means to not just know about Jesus, but to actually respond to him in the verses ahead. All right, this is one of the things that I think we can overlook in our modern day. Right? We have grown up, some of you, since before you even knew how to run a computer or smartphone. Others of you, obviously, this came into your life at a later point, but we have grown up with Google. Very much now, we are growing up with AI. You can find answers to things. Answers are only part of what we need. Right? Following Jesus is not just knowing a few facts that you can Google or that AI, maybe, can summarize for you, or it's not a knowledge exam. Right? This is, I think they call it something else now, but in school, I remember we always had the bubble sheet. Back when I was in school, it was the Iowa Test of Basic Skills, and it was assessing your knowledge. That's part of what's going on. You have to know who Jesus is, what he has done. We're never after less than knowledge, but we are after more. Because there are all kinds of people who know some very true things about Jesus and yet don't actually follow him. Right, responding to Jesus, responding to this knowledge of who he is, what he has done, that is crucial for what it means to be Christian. And here in Mark 3, we are going to see examples, two that are positive, two that are negative, of how to respond to Christ well. Now, before you think that this is only a gospel message in the evangelistic sense, which that would be more than enough right there, wouldn't it? I know I need to hear the gospel again and again and again. But there's also something for discipleship here, for those who have followed Jesus for many years. We'll get to that as we come to each of those. First, we're going to start with our first bad response. You see that again, Mark chapter 3, starting in verse 20. Then he went home, and the crowd gathered again, so that they could not even eat. And when his family heard it, they went out to seize him, for they were saying, "He is out of his mind." All right, so here's the first bad response. It's Jesus is crazy. I mean, that's what it is. If this sounds familiar, this scene that's being painted, it's because there was a very similar situation back in verse 9 of this same chapter. Right? The crowds, they're coming to Jesus. They're almost mobbing him. Pretty amazing response, actually. Now, that's not to say that everyone in the crowd is trusting Jesus as their Savior. I think we're going to see later in Mark that is clearly not the case. But they have come because they've heard all sorts of amazing things. They want to check it out for themselves. They want to see what's really going on here. This, by the way, is one reason why you and I shouldn't be so impressed with numbers. Our world is obsessed with numbers. 20,000 people turned into this, this announcement online. Well, did they listen to it? Did they just have it on in the background? Was it just running and they were in a different room? I mean, that numbers don't always mean something. Sometimes they do. Sometimes they don't. Whatever the case, though, we find that these crowds are starting to become noticed by others, by Christ's own earthly family, even the religious leaders of the time. And so here we get the first part of how Christ's family was responding to him, his own earthly family, and it's not encouraging. I mean, put yourself in their shoes, right? You don't have a Bible, you don't have Google, you don't have a New Testament left by the Gideons in the hotel. You don't really have the benefit of seeing the big picture of Jesus in the same way as we do. I mean, Jesus is the guy you grew up with or watched grow up. Now he's going around challenging these traditional Jewish teachings and drawing massive crowds to himself. It would be easy, if you didn't think closely about what he was teaching, to think that he's got delusions of grandeur, that he's lost it. I mean, come on. Yeah, I know Jesus. He was the little guy, and now he grew up. He's the carpenter's son. Well, what does he think he's doing? Why are the crowds coming to him? I mean, that would be a very human response, wouldn't it? And yet it would be one that's completely and entirely wrong. Don't judge just by appearances. Don't just think, well, I've heard something, but I know the real story. There's too much of that in our world now, just as there was then. Too much of this sort of, well, I know him, I know her, I know their past. God's not going to use them to do great things now. Who would say that? Oh, that actually seems to be a common refrain throughout the Scriptures, that God takes broken people and uses them for eternal purposes. Brothers and sisters, be very careful before you just dismiss someone. Certainly in this case, if you don't know Jesus, be very careful with this idea that I sometimes hear of just, well, he was delusional, he was just some teacher in the Judean countryside like many others, and they all had these wild ideas. And you need to examine what he's actually said and what prophecies he's actually fulfilling. Now, before we move on, I want you to notice something that will really help you as we continue in Mark's gospel. There's a fancy theological name for it. I don't like fancy names. I'm just going to call it, as some others have, a Markan sandwich. Right? How's that before lunch here? And what I mean by a Markan sandwich is it describes when Mark begins one story, like he does here with Jesus' family, and then it's like he sets it aside for a minute, introduces another story, and then he comes back to the first story. The most famous example of this has to do with Jesus going to raise the synagogue ruler's daughter. And in the middle, right, you get that picture of the woman who has been bleeding for years and years. And then it completes the story of raising the little girl at the end. Right? Mark does this for a reason. It's not just that he got interrupted and has something else to do. Instead, it's because he's trying to show us that there's some connection, there's something important with these stories. All right, so we're going to come back to Christ's family, but for now, let's go with Mark and let's see what the next story is, starting in verse 22. And the scribes who came down from Jerusalem were saying, "He is possessed by Beelzebul, and by the prince of demons he casts out the demons." Right? So this is response number 2. Jesus is possessed. That explains him. Well, how does Jesus respond? Look at verse 23. And he called them to him and said to them in parables, "How can Satan cast out Satan? If a kingdom is divided against itself, that kingdom cannot stand. And if a house is divided against itself, that house will not be able to stand. And if Satan has risen up against himself and is divided, he cannot stand, but is coming to an end. But no one can enter a strong man's house and plunder his goods unless he first binds the strong man. Then indeed he may plunder his house." All right, so we started with Jesus he's crazy, he's out of his mind, we just got to do something with him. To now, what do the religious leaders say? Well, they say, oh, well, he's possessed. That's how he's working these miracles, but don't follow him. He's in league with the devil. The accusation then is that Jesus, he might well be able to cast out demons and do all sorts of other things, but in their mind, the only way he could do that was because he had his own dark powers. Notice what they are completely unwilling to look at. Notice the blind spot. They're not even willing to consider what Jesus has been teaching and saying, and in fact, if you want to only look at the Old Testament, what the Old Testament prophecies have been pointing to, and Jesus is fulfilling, they're not willing to say, well, could this be the Messiah? No, they've decided they don't like him, and so they're going to come up with reasons to slur his character, reasons to make him seem like he has no credibility. Their minds have already been made up. They're unwilling to admit that they might be wrong. This, too, is a danger for us in 2025, isn't it? Too often we think about the world through certain lenses, and anything that doesn't fit that lens must be wrong. One of the most amazing things to me is when a person who has very strong convictions, I don't mean someone who just kind of goes with whatever the popular thing is, but someone who has strong convictions is willing to learn and admit, I hadn't thought of that. I might be wrong. There was a professor at the seminary that I'm at who a number of years ago had written an entire commentary, so a big book, over 1,000 pages on Matthew's Gospel. Phenomenal book. I mean, it's a lifetime of scholarship. And he went to a conference, and he was presenting at that conference and said some things, and then as conferences of this sort go, when you're not presenting, you might go and attend the presentation of someone else. And one of those presentations was by a very young student who had just recently graduated from the same school, interestingly. And his topic was arguing directly against what this author had said. He had said, hey, so much of your book is helpful, but there's one little thing here that I think you got wrong. And they were sitting there in the room, hundreds of people. This young, up-and-coming scholar is trying to say this, and then he sees the professor out in the audience. And he stops the presentation, and he says, I see that we have so-and-so here. With all due respect, I'm going to be arguing that I think you're wrong. So he goes forward and goes ahead and presents, and as conferences of this sort go, he gets to the very end, and there's time for Q&A. Right, that's one of those dreaded things. When I was defending my doctoral paper, they told me that there would be time for Q&A at the end if we didn't use all the time. And I was so grateful that we got to the end and they said, no, we think we'll be done. We don't need Q&A. And I was like, yes. In this case, though, they got questions and answers. And the first hand that went up was this older, wiser, senior professor's. And those who were there that day write that there was just, you could have heard a pin drop, quite literally. The room was just dead silent. And this older gentleman stood up and he said, young man, you've convinced me. I was mistaken. Right? That is humility. That is what we want. We don't want wishy-washy. That's not what I'm saying. We want to be people of strong convictions, but strong, right convictions. We want to still be teachable, still be growable. These Pharisees, these religious leaders, were not willing to do that. They had already decided nothing would change their minds. We'll find across Mark's gospel that there are a few who will come to faith in Christ, but by and large, as an organization, I guess you could call it there, they do not. They have decided there is nothing in Jesus worth considering. Now, so important is it to correct this false teaching that Jesus addresses it in two ways. Here's the first. Jesus makes the point that what these teachers were saying was ridiculous. I mean, if you just think about it for a couple of seconds, their whole claim makes no sense. Really, he's going to combat the forces of evil by casting demons out of people, using the power of the leader of those demons? How does that make any sense at all? And Jesus points this out in several different ways, doesn't he? It says it would be suicide. Christ's point is that he is working these miracles. He does have authority even over evil spirits, and therefore he is not in league with the devil. Christ clearly opposes the devil. So his first response is that what the scribes were saying doesn't pass the sniff test. Right? And brothers and sisters, I think this is true throughout life, but I'll keep my comments just here to the scriptures. We live in a world where there are so many ideas and opinions about what this verse means or what that passage says, or think about what you hear. Just because they're on some national radio platform or they have, hundreds of thousands of followers doesn't mean someone's right. Test everything by the Word of God. What does God say? Go with that. Think for a little bit about what's this person saying? Is that matching what I'm seeing here? Because if I'm not seeing it, I need to at least be asking some deep questions. Right? Don't be too quick to just change your mind on something if it's not what God has said. And if it is what God has said, then obviously that's the time to say, you know what, I got it wrong. Thank you, dear brother, dear sister, for pointing out to me what is true. One of my favorite authors of yesteryear, J.C. Ryle, says it this way. He says, he is your best friend who tells you the most truth. Sometimes that means truths we don't want to hear, and yet that's a real friend, aren't they? That's point number one. Here's point number two. Here's the second response. It comes in verses 28 to 30. Truly I say to you, all sins will be forgiven the children of man, and whatever blasphemies they utter. But whoever blasphemes against the Holy Spirit never has forgiveness, but is guilty of an eternal sin. For they were saying, he has an unclean spirit. Now, I'm going to actually say that we learned something about how to respond well to Jesus here. I'll get to that in just a second, because I realize that probably seems very opposite of what's going on. These are some of the most misunderstood verses in the Bible, but I think if we pay close attention to them, we're actually going to see comfort here. The first thing to note is that Jesus says there's forgiveness for sins. Right? I'm not sure why we just read over that and assume that. Why should God forgive anybody? Right? I mean, most kings or presidents or prime ministers don't turn to their arch enemies, to the ones who have taken up arms against them, the ones who have tried to remove them from power, and forgive them. It's astounding that God would do that. Dear friend, if that's not something you've thought of in a while, if that's not something that just resonates in your heart with, wow, God is good, then that's your takeaway today. God forgives sinners. Whatever it is that you have done. Maybe you are a liar, a thief, an adulterer. Perhaps like Paul, you were an accessory to murder. Or David, an actual murderer. You can be forgiven by this great God. Right? There is hope for you. There is no sin that is somehow outside of God's hope. What's more, Jesus will forgive your sins if you have faith in him. It's not just it might be, maybe if you figure out the Da Vinci Code of ancient way. No, Jesus will forgive your sins if you will turn to him, if you will be one of his disciples. Right? Full stop, no footnote, no fine print, no whoever that one guy is that they hire at the end of every commercial who reads super fast, not that guy. Right? None of that. There is forgiveness found in Jesus Christ. I want you to notice then that even blasphemy can be forgiven. And I think that's interesting. At the end of verse 28, whatever blasphemies they utter, God's grace is more powerful than our sin. Dear church, rest in that truth. Rejoice in that truth. This is why we sing on Sundays. So what then does verse 29 mean? How can Jesus then go on to say that there is a sin which will not be forgiven? Well, the key comes in verse 30. The scribes continue to accuse Jesus of being in league with the devil. And Christ's point then is simply this: if a person continues to rebel against the Lord, so surely and certainly that they refuse to acknowledge God's good ways, if they won't even acknowledge a difference between a good God and the evil ones who oppose him, then that person is rejecting God's forgiveness. If you reject God's forgiveness, you will not be saved. It's not as complicated sometimes as we make this sound, right? If you reject Jesus, as they are doing, then you will not be forgiven. It really is that clear. It really is that simple. Similarly, to reject the work of the Holy Spirit, the Comforter, who John tells us would be sent by Jesus in John's Gospel, is to reject the very one that we would receive after trusting the Lord. In effect, what Christ is pointing out is this would be like going to a doctor who has a life-saving treatment and saying, nah, I don't want that. If you reject the treatment, you will die. So it is here. If these religious leaders reject the only one who can forgive their sins, then they will die in their sins. They will not be forgiven. That then is the blasphemy that Jesus is pointing out. Let me give one other brief word on this. If you are worried that you've done this, right, if this is the passage and I read it and you're like, oh, I forgot that was there, oh, that's the one that, and you're really concerned that this next, you're going to go home, or this next week you're going to be worried about, am I really saved, or can I even be saved, or let me give you some hope here. I can confidently say if you are worried in that way, you have not committed this sin. Right? Your worry shows that you do care about who Christ is. It shows that you do want to follow him, that you do desire his forgiveness. And if that desire is yours, you are not blaspheming against Christ or the Spirit. I want you to notice the scribes and the Pharisees as a group never turn and have that kind of thought. They're never sitting there thinking, well, we might be wrong, maybe we should. No, remember, they're seeking to put Jesus to death. This is why Christ says there is no forgiveness in that situation. They reject Jesus. They remain steadfast in their rejection. Therefore, they are not forgiven. Sadly, tragically. But here's the good news. And it applied to those few religious leaders who did turn, just as it applies to you and me. There is no one in the Scriptures who looks to Christ for salvation and is then rejected. And there's no one who genuinely wants to be a disciple, and Jesus says, nah, you've blown it too much. Sorry, you're not in the club. Right? Sometimes we hear those kind of doubts from people. Oh, I've sinned so much, how could I be forgiven? Well, the good news is you can. Or sometimes maybe we have those doubts ourselves, as if, well, how could God do this if he really knew who I am? He does really know. And he forgives you anyway. This is the good news. So if these are your worries, you can rest easy this day, dear friend. Now, from this, we need to learn that there are dire and eternal consequences for turning away from the Lord's method of saving people. Right? Salvation isn't a game. This isn't something we just kind of trifle with and, oh, did you, you can recite, what Jesus did on the cross. Great, check. Wonderful. That's not what we're doing here. No, the point is to actually trust Jesus. Not just to know about him, it's important, but that knowledge would become how you live life, how you seek Him in your worries, how you trust Him for your eternal soul. Right? Have faith in the Son of God. That's the call here. Hold to all that He has said, everything that He has taught, and trust Him when He says that the Holy Spirit is the promise of your salvation, the down payment. His promises are sure and true. One other warning, and then we'll move to our final little chunk of verses here. Notice that it was the religious leaders who fell into this grave sin. I find that incredibly convicting. Sometimes we Christians are the ones who make faith far more complicated than it needs to be. Or in trying to defend a certain tradition, a certain idea, we go too far and we end up badly misunderstanding what the Bible says. Or we try to have the Bible selectively, fit what we want to think. Dear church, we must beware of this. I've often said that I think, and among the pastors I speak with, they would agree with me, typically, we Christians add to the Scriptures rather than taking away. We make salvation harder by saying, well, you've also got to know this, and you've got to do these 3 things, and we typically go beyond what is written. Be so careful. And ask yourself constantly, where do I see this in the Word? Where does God command this? Does He? Maybe He doesn't command this great idea. Okay. Then introduce it just like that. Hey, here's I think, a really good application. Doesn't mean everyone, but here's what I've found helpful. Great, that's enough. You don't have to go further than that. You don't have to require that everyone think exactly as you do on something that's allowed to be debatable by the Scriptures. Keep your eyes fixed on Christ. How do we do that well? Well, one example is, what has Christ said? Go back, look again and again. That example of the Bereans in Acts isn't there just as a nice historical footnote. That's there for you and I to learn from. They took the Scriptures seriously. What they listened to, they went and said, where do we see this? Okay, now how do we apply it? All right, cry out to the Lord for humility. That you would be continually changed by what God has said, rather than thinking that you've somehow mastered His Word. Right? If you do that, then I'm confident that these next verses will also be a comfort for you. Look at verse 31. And his mother and his brothers came. So notice, now we're getting the other half of the story. They had said he was crazy. Apparently they're coming to get him. And standing outside, they sent to him and called him. And a crowd was sitting around him, and they said to him, your mother and your brothers are outside seeking you. And he answered them, who are my mother and my brothers? And looking around at those who sat around him, he said, here are my mother and my brothers. For whoever does the will of God, he is my brother and sister and mother. We've returned now to the family, this family who had rejected him, who thought he was crazy. A little different than the scribes. These are both 2 wrong ways. Right? What lesson do we learn here? Well, I want you to notice first that even this scene tells us something. Where's the family? They're standing outside. Right? They're not next to Jesus. They're not near to him. Mark's even painting a scene for us, showing us there's a difference here. The crowd who followed him are the ones who are near. And then Jesus goes on to tell us there's something important there. Because second, look at how that flows into Christ's question. Who's part of his family? That should cause you and I to think. Right? If you never thought that you could be a part of Christ's innermost circle, think again. If you confidently think that you are on the inside because you know all the right things and you were, basically grew up in the church and that you've checked the boxes and walked the aisles, then again, make sure you know He in whom you believe. Here's the truth then. You and I can be a part of Christ's family. How? By doing God's will. Not to earn a place at the table. Jesus doesn't say that. But because it's God's will that none should perish. We can say much more about following Jesus. In fact, we will throughout this series. But we dare not say anything less than this. It starts with trusting Jesus as your Savior, with taking His words seriously, with following after Him. There's no way to follow after Him and not do what He said. And that's why following after Jesus is what the Bible tells us is the very definition of a disciple. You want to know God's will for your life? Friends, I can confidently say each and every person here, this is it. It's to trust and to follow after Jesus Christ, the Savior, who is our King. What are you going to do then in the week ahead? How will you follow after Jesus? How will you avoid the temptations and the pitfalls of minimizing or ignoring Him, of taking what He has said and either, I don't really like that, my coworkers are going to make fun of me, or I think Jesus should have said more, so I'm going. How will you just simply follow after Jesus this week? How will you cry out to Him in prayer, calling on the name of the Lord? How will you look to what He has said and depend on the Holy Spirit to make you faithful for all that He calls you to? Who else will you help to follow Jesus among your friends and family, your fellow students, your co-workers this week? Is there one person you could have a conversation with? Or even if, for whatever reason, not that, can you pray for them each day this week? Hey, wonderful if you can pray in their presence, but even if not there, will you just simply commit at home each day before you go to bed to pray for that person who needs to know Jesus? Or perhaps for that person who knows Jesus and yet is really struggling to follow Him? Right, can you do that? These, dear friends, are what it looks like to respond to Christ. It's to trust Jesus, to do what God says, and to enjoy Him together. Heavenly Father, this then is our prayer. Would you make us faithful responders of Jesus? Lord, would you diffuse our doubts, our questions, our concerns, not to make us unthinking, but that instead that we would think true thoughts, and that then we would be placed by you in situations where we could communicate that to others, where we could tell others of the hope that you have given within us. Lord, would you help us to be doers of what Christ has said. He's already done the work. We don't have to earn it. We thank you, because none of us could. I know I couldn't. But because He has done the work, we are free to follow our King. And so, Lord, would you make us ever more faithful followers of our King, day after day, until He calls us home or He returns. In Christ's name, amen.